When I returned from Afghanistan, my mother made me take off my uniform at the door. My sister, Cassandra, sneered, "You look like the help." But the thing that killed me was when my own fiancé, Griffin, looked at me and asked, "Diana, did you set us up?" They didn't know. They had just handed a weapon to the enemy. My name is Captain Diana Crowley. I'm 29 years old. For the last year, my world had been the dust of Bagram and the constant taste of adrenaline. The long flight home was a slow decompression, a journey back to a life I barely recognized. But through the bone-deep exhaustion, one image kept me going. The front door of our family home in McLean, Virginia. Home. A word that was supposed to mean warmth and a soft place to land. I stood on the threshold, my combat boots silent on the cold, polished Italian marble. The air inside didn't smell like home. It was a sterile floral scent, curated and impersonal. My desert-worn uniform, still carrying the faint, ghostly scent of Afghan dust, felt alien here, a relic from another planet. My mother, Genevieve, emerged from the living room. She was a vision of controlled elegance in a cream-colored silk blouse. She moved toward me, but stopped a careful 5 feet away, her approach a slow, deliberate assessment. Her eyes didn't look at my face. They scanned my uniform, and a tiny, almost imperceptible frown line appeared between her brows. "Diana, darling," she said, her voice a sweet melody that could hide the sharpest of blades. "It's so good to have you back." The words were correct, but her body language screamed a different truth. She gestured with a perfectly manicured hand toward the hallway. "Please use the guest bathroom and change. We're having a small dinner party tonight. This ensemble, it's just not appropriate for the atmosphere here." This ensemble. She spoke of the uniform I had earned with my own sweat and blood, as if it were a cheap, stained dress. She made it sound like a vulgarity, a piece of filth I had tracked onto her immaculate Persian rug. A cold knot tightened in my stomach. Before I could respond, a rustle of silk announced my younger sister. Cassandra glided down the grand staircase, a princess in an Oscar de la Renta gown. She paused, striking a pose, and let her gaze drift over me with theatrical disdain. "Oh my God," she sighed, her voice pitched just loud enough for the housekeeper, who was hovering nervously nearby, to hear clearly. "She looks like the help, just getting off her shift." The cruelty was so casual, so effortless. I saw the housekeeper flinch, but my mother simply offered Cassandra a tight, approving smile. My welcome home. I was seated at the far end of the long, gleaming mahogany dining table. A piece of furniture so vast it felt more like a diplomatic negotiating table. My name wasn't on the official, calligraphed seating chart. They had placed me next to a great-aunt whose memory was fading. A convenient buffer to ensure I wouldn't disrupt the flow of important conversation. My father, Alistair, gave me a single perfunctory nod from the head of the table before turning his full attention to a U.S. senator, their talk a low murmur of defense contracts and political capital. He was the silent architect of this family's coldness. His indifference was his consent. Bottles of silver oak Cabernet Sauvignon were uncorked, the dark red wine filling expensive crystal glasses. Toasts were made, their voices ringing with practiced enthusiasm, to Cassandra for organizing a charity gala, to Griffin, my sister's latest suitor, for his recent promotion. I was a ghost at their feast. At one point, the senator's wife, a kind woman, turned to me. "Diana, your mother mentioned you were in Afghanistan. It must have been quite an experience." A flicker of warmth ignited in my chest. For a second, I felt seen. I opened my mouth to answer, but my mother's laugh cut through the air. light and sharp as shattering glass. "Oh heavens, Margaret, it's all terribly complicated. Guns and sand and all that," she chirped, waving a dismissive hand. "Let's not bore everyone. Now, Cassandra was just telling us about their upcoming ski trip to Aspen." And just like that, the light was extinguished. The conversation flowed around me, over me, as if I weren't there. I sat perfectly still, my back straight, a habit drilled into me at West Point. I became a statue of a soldier, invisible, unheard. A piece of furniture that didn't match the decor. When the last of the guests had departed, I felt a wave of exhaustion so profound it was a physical weight. I dragged myself up the carpeted stairs, heading for the one place I thought was still mine, my old room. I pushed the door open. The wrong scent hit me first. Not the familiar smell of old books, but the overpowering sweetness of Chanel No. 5. I froze. My room was gone. In its place was a lavish, museum-quality walk-in closet. Rows of Jimmy Choo shoes stood at attention on illuminated shelves. A rainbow of Hermes handbags was displayed on glass pedestals, like priceless artifacts. It was Cassandra's shrine to herself. My heart hammered against my ribs. I scanned the opulent space, my eyes searching for any trace of me. Then I saw it. Tucked away in a dark corner, almost hidden behind a rack of fur coats, was a single brown cardboard box. My feet felt like lead as I crossed the plush carpet. Scrawled across the top, in my mother's elegant, looping handwriting, was a simple, brutal epitaph. "Diana's old stuff." My hands trembled as I knelt and lifted the flimsy flaps. Inside, nestled in the darkness, was my life. My medals, their ribbons neatly folded, the stack of letters I'd written home from the field. And on top, a small framed photo of my unit, their faces grinning and grimy under the Afghan sun. My brothers and sisters in arms, my real family. Everything I was, everything I had sacrificed, had been deemed stuff, packed away and discarded in a corner to make room for more shoes. This wasn't just a box, it was a tomb for a life they refused to acknowledge. And as my fingers traced the cold, hard metal of my bronze star, I realized this wasn't the first time they had tried to bury me. The cold of the marble floor seeped through my uniform, but it was nothing compared to the chill of that realization. This wasn't new. This systematic erasure of me had a history. A symphony they had been composing my whole life, with my sister as the soloist and me as the silent, discordant note they were always trying to tune out. The memories flooded back, sharp and vivid. It always began with the Steinway and Sons grand piano in the living room, its polished black surface reflecting a distorted version of our family. Cassandra would play, her fingers stumbling through simple melodies. Each hesitant note was met with breathless praise from my mother. "She just has an artist's soul," Genevieve would declare to her friends over afternoon tea. Cassandra's clumsy efforts were framed as nascent genius. She was the delicate flower to be nurtured. Summer trips to Paris to absorb the culture were her due. I, on the other hand, had taught myself to play. My fingers could fly across the keys, unlocking the complex, passionate heart of Chopin. But my music was never art. It was noise. "Diana, not so loud, please," my mother would say, her voice tight with annoyance. "You're disturbing your father." My talent wasn't an asset. It was a nuisance. Summer, for me, was a math camp in New Hampshire, practical, sensible, and far away. I remember one school recital. Cassandra, singing off-key, forgot the lyrics to a simple song and burst into tears on stage. My parents rushed to the front, enveloping her in a cocoon of comfort and reassurance. That same year, I won first place in the state science fair. I stood on the stage, a blue ribbon pinned to my chest, my project on astrophysics lauded by the judges. When I got home, I showed my father the award. He glanced at it briefly. "Good," he said, his eyes already returning to the Wall Street Journal. But a Crowley girl doesn't need to be so clever. She just needs to be charming. The message was clear. My achievements were liabilities. Cassandra's value was in her potential for a good marriage. Mine was a problem to be managed. The inequality was woven into the fabric of every holiday. One Christmas, Cassandra, at 16, found the keys to a brand new white BMW convertible under the tree. I received a professionally bound portfolio detailing the educational trust fund my parents had established for me. Their gift to her was freedom and fun. Their gift to me was a transaction, an obligation. It was their way of saying, "We've paid our dues. Now go be successful somewhere else." The most painful memory, the one that still felt like a raw wound, was from a Thanksgiving dinner when I was 16. Cassandra announced, with a dramatic flourish, that she had made the varsity cheerleading squad. The entire evening transformed into a celebration of her triumph. My mother beamed, recounting the grueling tryouts to our relatives. My father, in a rare display of exuberance, opened a vintage bottle of Dom Perignon, the pop of the cork echoing like a starting pistol for Cassandra's glorious future. That same week, a thick envelope had arrived for me. Inside was an early acceptance letter to the United States Military Academy at West Point. My heart had hammered with a pride so fierce it felt like it would burst. This was it. This was something real, something undeniable. During a lull in the conversation, I shyly slid the letter across the table to my father. He picked it up, his expression unreadable. He scanned the prestigious letterhead, the formal congratulations. Then he placed it face down on the table, next to a half-eaten slice of turkey. He frowned, not with anger, but with a weary disappointment. "The army?" he asked, his voice low. "That's no place for a lady, Diana. We'll discuss this later." Later never came. My achievement, arguably the most significant of any Crowley child, wasn't just downplayed, it was dismissed as a social faux pas, a baffling and slightly embarrassing choice. In their world, a pyramid of pom-poms was more valuable than a commission as an officer in the U.S. Army. But amidst that carefully orchestrated symphony of favoritism, there was one single, clear note of truth. My grandmother, Matilda Crowley. She was a woman of few words, but her eyes saw everything. She was the matriarch, the one even Genevieve handled with a measure of caution. After that disastrous Thanksgiving dinner, she found me in the library, pretending to read a book. While my vision blurred with unshed tears, she didn't offer platitudes. Instead, she pressed her old, sterling silver fountain pen into my hand. It was heavy and cool. "This world, Diana, and this family," she whispered, her voice a conspiratorial rustle, "will always try to put you in a box they've built for you. Don't you let them." She tapped my forehead gently. "Use this mind of yours as your weapon, and use that stubbornness as your shield." She looked me straight in the eye, her gaze steady and fierce. "Never apologize for who you are." Her words didn't magically heal the wounds, but they gave them a name. They gave me a purpose beyond just surviving my family's suffocating expectations. Her words became my compass, my armor, and in the desolate landscapes of Afghanistan, far from their gilded cage, I would finally learn how to wield the weapons she had given me. My grandmother's words became my compass, my armor, and in the desolate landscapes of Afghanistan, far from their gilded cage, I finally learned how to wield the weapons she had given me: my mind, my stubbornness. At Bagram Air Base, during Operation Enduring Freedom, there were no Steinway pianos or Dom Perignon. My world was a cramped, windowless room filled with the glow of monitors, a world of encrypted data streams, urgent intelligence reports, and the constant, low-grade hum of a base at war. Here, charm was useless. Your value was measured in one thing only: your ability to keep people alive. Every decision I made as an intelligence officer could mean the difference between a platoon coming home or not coming home at all. I learned to read the truth, not in polished speeches, but in the silences between words, in the subtle hesitation in a source's voice over a crackling satellite link, in the flicker of an eye on a grainy drone feed. I learned to trust my intuition, the cold, hard knot in my gut that told me when a piece of intelligence felt too clean, too easy. I remember one night staring at a report from a usually reliable informant detailing a planned supply route. Everything checked out. The data was perfect, but something felt wrong. A nagging inconsistency I couldn't articulate. Against protocol, I advised the convoy commander to reroute. My own commanding officer warned me that if I was wrong, my career would take a serious hit. I stood my ground. Hours later, we received word that a massive IED had detonated on the original route, exactly where the convoy would have been. 3 soldiers were alive because of a hunch. That night, alone in the silent command center, a profound sense of satisfaction settled over me. It was a feeling deeper and more meaningful than any applause at a society gala in McLean could ever provide. No one threw a party, no one popped a bottle of champagne, but I didn't need it. The knowledge that 3 families would not receive a devastating phone call was the only reward that mattered. A week after that quiet victory, I managed to get a call home. Cassandra answered, her voice a bubbly stream of chatter about the agonizing choice between Guards Red and Racing Yellow for her new Porsche. I tried to tell her a little about my work, about the immense responsibility. She cut me off with a light laugh. "Oh God, Diana, that sounds so stressful. You should just come home. Griffin just bought a penthouse at the wharf. The view of the Potomac is to die for. That's the real world, you know." The real world. Her words hung in the air between continents. For her, the real world was a collection of luxury goods and waterfront properties. For me, the real world was the suffocating fear in a young soldier's eyes before his first patrol. It was the gut-wrenching duty of writing a letter to a fallen comrade's parents. The chasm between us had become an impassable canyon. Before I left Afghanistan for the last time, I stood on the dusty tarmac, the epic, jagged peaks of the Hindu Kush Mountains, stark against the sky. I thought of the soldiers who wouldn't be making the journey home, their faces etched into my memory. I thought of their families, forever broken, and then I thought of my own family, living in their bubble of blissful ignorance, a world where they mistook courage for naivete and sacrifice for a poor life choice. I placed a hand over my heart, the rough fabric of my uniform a familiar comfort. I made a silent vow, not to God or to country, but to myself. I would never again let them define me. I would never let their shallow, glittering world tarnish the one I had fought to protect, the one built on honor and loyalty. The oath wasn't spoken aloud. It was forged in the fire of my disillusionment and carved into my soul, as hard and as unyielding as the mountains before me. I didn't look back. The heavy oak door of the McLean mansion clicked shut behind me, the sound as final as a gavel strike. severing a tie I hadn't realized was already frayed to a single, pathetic thread. I threw my duffel bag into the back of my old Jeep Wrangler, the engine turning over with a familiar, comforting rumble that felt more like home than anything I'd experienced in the last few hours. There was only one place to go. I drove through the manicured streets of Northern Virginia, past the sprawling estates and private schools, and crossed the bridge into Arlington. I sought out a small, unassuming bar tucked away on a side street, a place called the Old Guard. It was a haven, a dimly lit sanctuary for veterans, a place where you didn't have to translate the silent language of shared sacrifice. The moment I stepped inside, the air rich with the scent of old oak, spilled beer, and quiet understanding wrapped around me like a worn but welcome blanket. Wyatt Wrench Callahan was already there, holding down a dark corner booth as if he'd been born in it. A former cyber warfare specialist from my unit, Wyatt was built like a heavyweight boxer, but had the gentle, unnervingly observant eyes of a scholar. A half-empty glass of Jack Daniels sat on the scarred wooden table in front of him. He didn't stand. He didn't offer a hollow hug or a formal handshake. He just watched me as I slid into the booth opposite him, the worn leather of the seat sighing under my weight. He studied my face for a long, silent moment, his gaze taking in the exhaustion I couldn't hide, the faint tremor in my hands I couldn't quite control. Then he spoke, his voice a low, steady gravel that could cut through any noise. "You look like you just walked through hell." One sentence, no pity, no platitudes, just a raw, honest observation that saw straight through the disciplined mask I wore. And in that moment, the dam inside me, the one I'd been reinforcing with military precision, finally broke. The story of my welcome home spilled out of me in a torrent. The uniform treated like a dirty rag, the cold exclusion at dinner, Cassandra's casually cruel words, the shocking sight of my childhood room transformed into a shrine for her shoes. I told him everything, my voice thick with a pain I hadn't allowed myself to fully feel until the safety of his presence. Wyatt didn't interrupt. He just listened, his gaze never leaving mine. He nursed his whiskey, and his occasional slow nod was a confirmation, an act of validation more comforting than 1,000 empty apologies. He didn't say, "I'm sorry to hear that," or "everything will be okay." When I finally fell silent, my throat raw and my story hanging in the air between us, he took a slow sip of his drink, the ice clinking softly. "They're snakes, Diana," he said simply, his tone devoid of surprise. "And you need an anti-venom specialist." He didn't try to offer solutions or tell me what to do. Instead, in the quiet of that bar, he shared a piece of his own hell. He told me about his stepfather, a man who had secretly sold his biological father's military medals his dad had earned in Vietnam before he was killed in action, to help pay for a new fishing boat. "Some people," Wyatt said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, his gaze fixed on the amber liquid in his glass, "they just don't have the hardware to understand things that can't be bought. Honor, loyalty, sacrifice. To them, those are just empty words on a government building. They're ghosts." And for the first time since I'd landed on American soil, I didn't feel like a freak. I wasn't the only one in the world carrying this invisible scar, this deep, aching bewilderment at how the people who were supposed to love you most could fail to see what truly matters. We sat there in a comfortable silence that followed, drinking cheap beer, Sam Adams for me, Jack for him. The quiet between us was filled with more genuine connection, more real family than I had ever felt during the loud, extravagant, and hollow parties my mother loved to throw. As I got ready to leave, a little of the icy chill from my parents' house, finally starting to thaw, Wyatt put a steadying hand on my shoulder. His grip was firm, a silent promise of solidarity. "Listen to me, Diana," he said, his eyes serious and clear. "I may not have Crowley money or Crowley power, but I have a very particular set of skills." A rare, wry smile touched his lips. Everything in their glittering world is digitized: contracts, emails, text messages, financial records. Nothing is ever truly gone if you know how to dig. "You are not in this fight alone. You call me when you're ready." His promise hung in the air, a lifeline thrown into the dark waters I was drowning in. Just then, my phone buzzed on the table, the vibration sharp and intrusive. A text from a number I knew by heart, Genevieve. The message was 5 stark words long. "Come home immediately, family matter." Wyatt glanced at the screen, his expression hardening instantly. His voice was low and urgent, a field commander's warning. "Be careful," he said. "When a snake feels threatened, it bites. That's a trap." Wyatt's warning, "That's a trap," echoed in my mind as I drove back to the McLean mansion, but the pull of the words "family matter" was a deeply ingrained reflex, a gravitational force I hadn't yet learned how to escape. I walked through the front door and stepped directly onto a stage. The air in the living room was thick with a tension so palpable it felt like I was breathing water. It was a perfectly crafted tableau, a scene from a movie designed to elicit shock and pity. There was Cassandra, curled into a fetal position on the ridiculously expensive Italian sofa. Her designer dress artfully rumpled. She was weeping, but it was a beautiful, tragic kind of weeping. The kind that didn't make your face red or blotchy. Each sob was a delicate, heart-wrenching tremor. There was my mother, Genevieve, seated beside her, one hand stroking Cassandra's hair in a gesture of maternal protection, while her other hand rested possessively on her shoulder. Her eyes, when they met mine, were filled with a cold, simmering accusation. There was Griffin, perched on the edge of an armchair, looking like a man who had just survived a car crash. His usually pristine shirt was unbuttoned at the collar. His face was pale and hollow, his eyes vacant. He was the picture of a man in shock. And completing the scene, there was a Fairfax County police officer, standing casually by the fireplace. He had a notebook open, but his posture was relaxed, familiar. This wasn't an official investigation. This was a house call to a family friend. "Good evening, Ms. Crowley," the officer said, nodding at me with a practiced, placid expression. "We're just taking a statement about a family incident." Incident. The word was so sterile, so deliberately bland. It was a clinical term for the meticulously staged play of betrayal unfolding before me. Through her theatrical sobs, Cassandra began her performance. Her voice was a fragile whisper, trembling with manufactured fear. I don't know what happened," she breathed, dabbing at her dry eyes with the back of her hand. I woke up and Griffin was in my room. I was so scared, so confused." She never used the word assault. She didn't have to. The way she flinched when she glanced at Griffin, the way she curled in on herself as if to ward off a blow, the shame and terror she projected, it painted a horrifying, damning picture without a single explicit accusation. It was a masterpiece of manipulation. My intelligence training kicked in, overriding the initial shock. I needed facts, not drama. "Griffin," I said, my voice steady, cutting through Cassandra's quiet whimpers. "What happened?" Before he could answer, Genevieve shot up from the sofa, her movement a whip crack of indignation. "Diana, for God's sake," she hissed, her voice dripping with righteous fury. "Can't you see your sister is suffering? This is a time for family to protect one another, not for you to march in here and conduct a military interrogation." Her genius was breathtaking. In one swift move, she had framed my search for the truth as a cold, unfeeling attack. She had weaponized compassion to silence me, painting me as the heartless outsider while she played the role of the fierce mother lioness protecting her wounded cub. The officer shifted his weight, his gaze now on me, tinged with disapproval. I was no longer a decorated captain, I was a problem. The officer, a man I now recognized as a regular at my father's golf club, closed his notebook. "Well," he announced with an air of finality, "since Ms. Crowley isn't pressing charges, there's no official complaint to be made. I'll just file this as a domestic disturbance." He gave my mother a reassuring nod, tipped his hat, and let himself out. He was an actor who had delivered his lines and was now exiting the stage. The click of the front door plunged the room into a heavy, suffocating silence. The air was thick with unspoken words, with the lingering poison of the lie. My gaze settled on Griffin. Griffin, the man I was supposed to marry. The man who had written me letters in Afghanistan. Letters filled with promises of a future, of a life we would build together. Letters I had read and reread in the dark, a talisman against fear and loneliness. He finally looked up, his eyes meeting mine across the room. I searched his face for an ally, for a flicker of the man I thought I knew, for a silent plea for help. I found nothing. His expression wasn't one of confusion or shared horror. It was a mask of cold suspicion and a dawning, craven fear for himself. "Diana," he said, his voice a hoarse, unrecognizable croak. "You've always been jealous of Cassandra. I know you weren't happy that she and I were getting closer." He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. His eyes, now filled with a desperate, self-serving logic, narrowed. Did you set us up?" The question wasn't a question. It was a verdict. It was the final, twisting turn of a knife that had been slipped between my ribs the moment I walked through the door. It wasn't just an accusation. It was an assassination of my character, of our past, of every beautiful memory I had foolishly held on to. In that moment, he didn't just side with them. He became them. And the last ember of love I had for him turned to ice-cold ash. His question, "Did you set us up?" hung in the poisoned air of the living room. A final perfect act of cruelty. I looked at Griffin's face, a mask of weak, cowardly fear. I looked at Cassandra, whose fake sobs had subsided into a look of smug victory. I looked at my mother, her expression one of cold, righteous triumph. And in that moment, something inside me didn't just break. It shattered into a million pieces, and then, in the silence that followed, those pieces began to reform. Not into the soft, vulnerable shape of a heart, but into something hard, sharp, and cold. Something like a weapon. A chilling clarity washed over me. I finally understood. This wasn't just about sidelining me or being jealous of my career. This was an extermination. They didn't just want to remove me from the family portrait. They wanted to destroy the negative itself. They wanted to make me the villain of my own life story. A cautionary tale of the unstable daughter who came back from the war wrong. I didn't argue. I didn't scream. I didn't give them the satisfaction of another tear. I simply held Griffin's gaze for one last long moment, letting him see the death of every good thing that had ever been between us. Then I turned my back on all of them. I walked out of the living room, my steps measured and silent. Their stunned silence followed me up the grand staircase. I went to the guest room, the room that had been mine for a day, and retrieved my single duffel bag. I didn't pack. I just took what was mine. I walked back down the stairs, past the living room where they still sat like figures in a wax museum, and out the front door. I didn't look back. This wasn't a retreat. It wasn't a surrender. It was a strategic withdrawal. In the military, you learn that sometimes the most powerful move is to pull back, regroup, and choose your own battlefield. The rage that should have consumed me, the grief that should have drowned me, did something else instead. It was a furnace, burning away all the soft, sentimental parts of me, all the foolish hope I had clung to. And what was left was forged into something new, something like steel. I drove without a destination, my hands steady on the wheel of my Jeep. The pristine, tree-lined streets of McLean blurred into a meaningless pattern. I ended up on the George Washington Memorial Parkway, pulling over at a scenic overlook. Below me, the dark, silent waters of the Potomac River reflected the glittering lights of the Capitol. The Lincoln Memorial, the Washington Monument, the distant illuminated dome of the Capitol building. The heart of American power. My family's world. They saw themselves as a part of that world. The Crowley name, Crowley Defense Systems, it was all woven into the fabric of this city's power structure. They thought their position was unassailable. They thought I was just one broken soldier, a negligible threat, easily discredited and crushed under the weight of their influence and wealth. But they had made a critical error. They had forgotten who I was. I wasn't just a soldier. I was an intelligence officer. And an intelligence officer never ever goes into a fight unprepared. You don't engage the enemy without reconnaissance, without a strategy, without knowing their weaknesses, and you never ever fight on their terms. They had underestimated their enemy, and in doing so they had given me my mission. Standing there in the cold night air, the wind whipping strands of hair across my face, my grandmother Matilda's words echoed in my head, as clear as if she were standing right beside me. Use this mind of yours as your weapon, and use that stubbornness as your shield. I took a deep breath, the crisp air clearing the last vestiges of shock from my system. I made a vow, a promise whispered into the darkness, carried on the wind toward the city of power. I will not let you bury me, I said to the ghosts of my family. I will use the one thing you are all terrified of, the truth, and I will bring your fortress of lies crashing down around you. A cold, clean sense of purpose settled over me. The battle had been declared. It was time to assemble my forces. I pulled out my phone, my fingers moving with swift, certain precision. My first call was to Wyatt. He answered on the second ring. "Wrench," I said. My voice was calm, level, devoid of any tremble. It was the voice of a commanding officer giving an order. "It's time. I need everything you can find. Crowley Defense Systems, Griffin Prescott. Every shell corporation, every backroom deal, every buried email. I want it all. Start now." There was no hesitation on the other end of the line, just a simple, unwavering response. "Roger that, Captain." He knew. He didn't need to ask what had happened. He had seen the storm gathering. My second call was more difficult. I scrolled through the contacts I had inherited from my grandmother, a list she had insisted I keep. My finger stopped on a name circled in red ink. Victoria Sterling, a legendary DC lawyer with a reputation for taking on the untouchable, and a nickname whispered with fear and reverence in the city's corridors of power. The Destroyer. Have you ever been pushed so far, so completely to the edge, that you realize you have nothing left to lose? That's a terrifying place to be, but it's also the most powerful place on earth, because when you have nothing left to lose, you have everything to gain. I pressed the call button. The fight for my life had officially begun. The next morning, I walked into the K Street offices of Victoria Sterling. This was not a typical law firm. There were no dusty books or mahogany-paneled walls. It was a sleek, modern, glass and steel space that felt less like a law office and more like a military command center. Large screens on the walls displayed silent streams of financial data and news feeds. A team of sharp, focused associates moved with the quiet precision of a special operations unit. This was the heart of power in D.C., and Victoria Sterling was its 5-star general. Victoria herself was a force of nature, a woman in her late 50s with a shock of platinum blonde hair cut in a severe bob, wearing a power suit so sharp it could cut glass. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. She looked me up and down, her gaze analytical, and gestured for me to sit. "Captain Crowley," she began, her voice crisp and authoritative. "I've reviewed the preliminary notes from your call. Your family plays dirty." A thin, dangerous smile touched her lips. "Good. That means we don't have to play by their rules. We'll write new ones." She explained her philosophy, which sounded remarkably like military strategy. The first step was not to attack, but to gather intelligence. Know your enemy. Find their weaknesses. Sun Tzu would have approved. "In a DC war, Captain," she said, leaning forward, her eyes glinting. "The winner isn't the one who shouts the loudest. It's the one who has the last, most damning file. Our job is to find that file." We were launching an intelligence operation. I named it in my head, Operation Veritas, Truth. While Victoria and her team began preparing the initial legal filings, a strategic move to put the Crowley empire on the defensive, Wyatt and I established our own forward operating base. It was a sterile, anonymous corporate apartment he'd secured, a place with no connection to me. It became our digital war room. Wyatt Callahan, a man who could dismantle a rifle blindfolded, now sat hunched over a bank of laptops, his fingers flying across the keyboards. He was no longer a soldier, he was a digital miner, and he was digging for gold in the dark, encrypted servers of the Crowley dynasty. Using open-source intelligence techniques and a few backdoors he knew from his former life, he began to peel back the layers of their pristine public image. The first pieces of the puzzle began to surface. Griffin's corporate credit card statements, showing a pattern of lavish gifts for Cassandra, jewelry from Tiffany's, weekend getaways to 5-star hotels, all billed to his expense account. Then came the emails, a chain between Genevieve and a few key board members of Crowley Defense Systems, full of carefully coded language about a generational transition and the need for leadership that was more aligned with the company's modern image. It was a quiet coup, planned months in advance. Each discovery was a small validation, a confirmation that the injustice I felt wasn't just in my head. And then Wyatt found something else. Acting on a hunch from Victoria's team, he pulled the access logs for my grandmother Matilda's safety deposit box at a private bank in Georgetown. It had been accessed just once since her death by Genevieve, but the bank's legal counsel, a former colleague of Victoria's, also provided a crucial piece of information. Per Matilda's instructions, a second smaller box had been established in my name, to be opened only by me. Inside that cold metal box, nestled amongst old bonds and property deeds, was a small, unassuming external hard drive. Taped to it was a note in my grandmother's spidery handwriting. It was a line from the Bible, John 8:32, "And the truth shall set you free." Back at the apartment, my heart pounded as Wyatt plugged the drive into his laptop. We stared at the password prompt. The hint was the Bible verse. The answer was obvious. I typed it in, VERITAS. The drive opened. It was a treasure trove. My quiet, reserved grandmother, it turned out, had been a spy master in her own right. For years, she had been meticulously documenting the rot within her own family. There were scanned copies of emails, audio recordings of phone calls made on the library's landline, even keylogger software files from the family's desktop computer. She had seen it all coming, and then we found it, buried deep in a folder labeled Contingency. A video file. It was from a hidden security camera, positioned in the corner of her private study. The date stamp was from just a few days before I came home. The video showed Genevieve and Cassandra sipping tea. Cassandra let out a little tinkling laugh. "Mother, do you really think the little drama with Griffin will work?" she asked, sounding more like a bored co-conspirator than a future victim. Genevieve placed her teacup down with a delicate click. Her face was a mask of cold composure. Her voice, when she replied, was pure ice. "Darling," she said, looking directly at her favored child, "with a little Ambien in his wine and a few of your pretty tears, we can manipulate any man in this city, including your father." The boardroom of Crowley Defense Systems was my family's fortress. It was a cathedral of power, all dark mahogany, supple leather, and floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a panoramic view of the Washington, D.C. skyline. This was where they felt most invincible. It was the perfect stage for their downfall. Victoria's intelligence network had informed us that Genevieve and Alistair had called an emergency meeting of the board. The agenda, disguised in bland corporate language, was clear to us. They were going to formally discredit me, paint me as mentally unstable, and consolidate their power. They were moving to neutralize the threat. They just didn't know the threat was already inside the gates. We arrived as Genevieve was in the middle of her master performance. We stood outside the heavy wooden doors for a moment, listening, her voice oozing with feigned sorrow and maternal concern, carried into the hallway. "It is with the heaviest of hearts that we must address these unfortunate rumors," she was saying. "They stem from our eldest daughter, Diana. As you know, she has recently returned from a difficult tour in Afghanistan, and we now believe she is suffering from severe post-traumatic stress. Her accusations, while heartbreaking, are entirely baseless fantasies, born of trauma. She was painting her masterpiece, framing me as a broken, delusional veteran. I could picture the scene inside, the solemn, powerful men of the board, their faces etched with sympathy, nodding along. They were swallowing the beautiful, well-packaged lie. That was our cue. Victoria pushed the doors open, and we stepped inside. Silence. A sudden, complete cessation of sound and movement. It was as if someone had hit the pause button on the entire room. 12 pairs of eyes, the most powerful men in the defense industry, swiveled towards us. Genevieve's face went white, the color draining from her cheeks as if a plug had been pulled. The carefully constructed mask of the grieving mother shattered, revealing the raw shock beneath. Alistair, my father, shot to his feet, his face turning a deep, mottled red. It was the most emotion I'd seen from him in 20 years. "Diana," he boomed, his voice echoing in the acoustically perfect room. "What is the meaning of this? Who allowed you in here?" Victoria Sterling smiled, a slow, cold smile that didn't reach her eyes. She walked forward with the unhurried grace of a predator and placed a thick, leather-bound document on the polished table with a heavy, definitive thud. "Mr. Crowley," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a surgeon's scalpel. "As legal counsel for the late Matilda Crowley's estate, and as the designated proxy for what will soon be the largest single shareholder in this company, Captain Crowley has every right to be here." A fresh wave of shock rippled through the room. My father stared at the document as if it were a venomous snake. "And," Victoria continued, her gaze sweeping across the stunned faces of the board members, "we have a few items we'd like to add to the agenda, a few points of information that require clarification." While all eyes were on Victoria, I walked calmly to the head of the table. I didn't look at my mother or my father or Cassandra or Griffin. I looked at the screen of the state-of-the-art projection system. With a steady hand, I inserted the USB drive, my grandmother's legacy, my weapon, into the port. The Veritas drive. "Gentlemen," I said, my voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room, "if you'll indulge me, I have a short intelligence briefing to present." The screen flickered to life. The first file I played was an audio clip. It was a recording of a phone call between Genevieve and my grandmother from years ago. Genevieve's voice, bullying and cruel, trying to coerce Matilda into signing over voting rights to her shares. A low murmur went through the room. Board members shifted uncomfortably in their leather chairs. The second file was a video, grainy from a restaurant security camera. It showed Cassandra and Griffin at a cozy corner table. Cassandra was laughing, bragging about how she'd accidentally deleted a crucial work-related email I had sent from Afghanistan, an email about a potential job offer with a rival firm. Griffin just smiled and refilled her wineglass. He didn't protest, he was complicit. I saw one of the board members, a retired general, narrow his eyes, his expression turning to stone. And then, the final file, the kill shot, the video from my grandmother's study filled the screen. Cassandra, looking bored and beautiful. Genevieve, the picture of maternal control. Cassandra's voice, clear as a bell. "Mother, do you really think the little drama with Griffin will work?" And then Genevieve's reply, her voice as cold and empty as a winter grave. "Darling, with a little Ambien in his wine and a few of your pretty tears, we can manipulate any man in this city, including your father." A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. It was followed by a cacophony of choked sounds, a strangled cry from Cassandra, a sharp intake of breath from my father. Every head turned. Griffin was staring at Cassandra, his face a mask of utter, horrified disbelief. He looked like a man who had just realized the angel he'd been worshipping was, in fact, a demon. My father, Alistair Crowley, the silent titan, was staring at his wife, Genevieve. For the first time, he was seeing the woman he had married not as a partner, but as the puppeteer who had been pulling his strings all along. His face was slack with a dawning, sickening comprehension, and the board members, their faces were a study in disgust. The sympathy they'd felt moments before had curdled into contempt. They looked at my family as if they were something vile they had just found clinging to the bottom of their shoe. I clicked the remote. The screen went black. I let the silence hang in the air for a long, heavy moment. A silence thick with the wreckage of lies. Then I looked slowly around the table, meeting the eyes of each board member, one by one. My voice was quiet, calm, and final. "Are there any questions?" The silence that followed my question in the boardroom was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of a dynasty cracking. of a fortress crumbling from the inside out. Victoria Sterling and I walked out of that room, leaving the wreckage behind for them to sort through. There was no triumph in my steps, no elation, just the bone-deep weariness of a soldier after a long and brutal battle. The war was over. Now came the aftershocks. The news broke with the speed and ferocity of a lightning strike. The Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal ran stories about the internal upheaval at Crowley Defense Systems. The company's stock plummeted. In an emergency session I did not attend, the board of directors, scrambling to stop the bleeding, voted to indefinitely suspend Genevieve, Alastair, and Griffin from all duties and launched a full internal investigation. The empire my father had built on a foundation of secrets had been shaken to its core. That evening my phone rang. It was my father. For the first time in my life, I heard something other than disappointment or indifference in his voice. I heard raw, unfiltered panic. "Diana, what have you done?" he demanded, his voice thin and reedy. "You're destroying everything I've built." I stood in the quiet of my small, safe apartment, looking out at the city lights. I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were observing a scene from a great distance. "I didn't destroy it, Dad," I replied, my voice calm and devoid of emotion. "I just turned on the lights. The cracks were there all along." I ended the call before he could respond. The click of the phone, a small, definitive sound. A few days later, there was a knock on my door. It was Griffin. He looked terrible. He was unshaven, his expensive suit was rumpled, and the arrogant confidence that had been his defining feature was gone, replaced by a desperate, haunted look. "Diana, I'm so sorry," he stammered, his words tumbling over each other. "I was manipulated. I was a fool. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. I still love you." I looked at him, the man I had once planned my future with. I felt no anger, no hatred, just a profound, chilling pity. He was a hollow man, a vessel waiting to be filled by the ambitions of others. "No, Griffin, you don't love me," I said, my voice gentle but firm. "You loved the idea of me. You loved what a decorated captain from a powerful family could do for your career. And when I no longer fit into that plan, you were ready to discard me. Your love is conditional, and I'm no longer accepting applications." I didn't slam the door. I simply closed it softly in his face, shutting out the last ghost of a life I no longer wanted. The final communication came from Cassandra, a long, rambling text message filled with venomous accusations and curses. "You ruined my life. You're a monster. I hope you're happy. You'll be miserable and alone forever." I read the words on the screen, and I felt nothing, just a vast, quiet emptiness. The rage was gone. The pain was gone. There was only a deep, profound fatigue. I didn't reply. I simply deleted the message thread. Instead, I made one last call. I dialed my mother's number. She answered on the first ring. "Diana," she said, her voice a low whisper. "Mother," I said, my tone formal, final. "This ends now. Victoria has advised me that we have grounds for criminal charges, but I'm not going to do that." I took a breath. "In exchange, I want one thing. I want you, all of you, to disappear from my life, permanently. No calls, no texts, no third-party messages. We are done." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could hear her breathing. Then she spoke, her voice filled with a lifetime of self-deception. "You were always such a cold child, Diana." I thought of the articles I had been reading by Brené Brown about how setting boundaries is not an act of aggression, but of courage and self-respect. "No," I replied, a newfound clarity ringing in my voice. I was just a survivor. I ended the call. Then I opened my contacts list. Alistair Crowley, Genevieve Crowley, Cassandra Crowley, Griffin Prescott. One by one I selected their names, and one by one I pressed block contact. The digital severance was swift, silent, and absolute. The fortress had fallen, and I had finally truly walked away from the rubble. Months passed, the seasons turned. The noise from the fall of the House of Crowley eventually faded, replaced by new scandals in the relentless DC news cycle. As the executor of Matilda's will, Victoria Sterling handled the legalities. The sprawling mansion in McLean was sold. My inheritance, a controlling interest in a company I wanted no part of, was liquidated. The money sat in an account, a silent testament to a life I had fought to escape. I never went back to McLean. Instead, I drove west, away from the city, deep into the heart of the Shenandoah Valley. I drove to my grandmother's old farm. The house was a simple, rustic log cabin, worlds away from the cold marble of my childhood home. And surrounding it, rolling gently over the hills, was a breathtaking sea of purple. Her lavender farm was in full bloom. I stepped out of my Jeep, and the scent washed over me, clean, calming, and deeply peaceful. It was a fragrance no expensive Chanel perfume could ever hope to replicate. I walked through the rows of fragrant plants, the afternoon sun warm on my shoulders. I ran my hand gently over the delicate purple buds, just as my grandmother had taught me. She used to say, "Lavender doesn't shout for attention, Diana, but it has the power to heal." Walking through that field, I finally understood the true nature of the inheritance she had left me. It wasn't the stocks or the voting rights. It wasn't the power to destroy. It was this quiet strength, this capacity for healing. This was her real legacy. With a portion of the money, I established a foundation, the Matilda Project. Its mission was simple: to provide seed funding and mentorship for female veterans wanting to start their own businesses. I wanted to turn the weapons of my war, both in Afghanistan and in DC, into tools to build something new. Standing there, amidst the soft buzzing of bees and the calming scent of the lavender, I pulled out my phone and read an email that had come in that morning. It was from a recipient of our first grant, a former Marine sergeant who had started her own logistics company. She wrote, "Captain Crowley, I wanted you to know that your story gave me the courage to leave a toxic corporate job and finally bet on myself. You reminded me that we are not defined by the battles we lose or even the ones we win. We are defined by how we rise after we have been knocked down. Thank you." Tears welled in my eyes and spilled, hot and silent, down my cheeks. But for the first time in a long, long time, they were not tears of pain or rage. They were tears of connection, tears of purpose. That verse my grandmother left me from Corinthians came to mind. The old has gone, the new is here. I had thought my victory was in tearing down a fortress of lies, but I was wrong. The real victory was in this, in building something true in its place. The next morning, I was sitting on the porch of the cabin, a steaming mug of coffee in my hands, watching the mist burn off the blue-tinged mountains. Wyatt's Jeep rumbled up the gravel driveway. He got out, carrying 2 more coffees from a diner in town and a copy of the new Forbes magazine. He handed me a coffee and pointed to the cover. It was a glossy photo of a woman I barely recognized, with a headline that read, "The Soldier and the Startup, Diana Crowley's New Mission." Wyatt grinned. "Look at you, Captain, from warrior to venture capitalist." I smiled, a genuine, easy smile that reached my eyes. I looked away from the magazine, out at the endless fields of purple. "I'm just a gardener, Wrench," I said softly. "Just a gardener." We sat there together in comfortable silence, sipping our coffee as the sun climbed higher, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. A new dawn, one of my own making. The past was still there, of course. It always would be. It lived in me like the faint, silvery lines of scars, no longer open wounds, but reminders of a journey, reminders of where I had been, and of the strength I had discovered along the way. I didn't need the approval of the Crowleys. I didn't need the forgiveness of Griffin. I had found my own peace, cultivated in a field of lavender. And that, I knew, was the only victory that ever truly mattered. That peace, the kind you build for yourself after the storm, is something I've learned we all deserve. My story has its own unique details, but I know that feeling of being underestimated, of having to fight for your own truth, is universal. It makes me wonder about your journey. What was that one moment for you? The final straw, the line in the sand that made you realize you had to choose your own dawn over someone else's darkness. Share your moment of clarity in the comments below. If you believe in the power of resilience and rewriting our own endings, please follow the Chosen Revenge channel. There are so many more stories of strength waiting to be told, and we'd be honored to share them with you.